Good morning, good afternoon, good evening. Welcome to Late Night Learning. I am your host, Dr. Anthony Palomba. Now, last time we were talking about streaming music services as part of a lecture on audio and music and radio. Today we're going to be going through a few more of the streaming services as well as some other historical details about the audio industry, namely artists and how they kind of came about in the music industry and kind of the evolution of genres for that matter. Let's get started. So last time we were talking about streaming music services and how they've kind of been a boon for the industry. As we know, music streaming services are remarkably useful when we think about the ways in which that we get to listen to music really without being encumbered by technology. We're able to listen to music from our iPods, our phones, and our tablets. These are easier devices to walk around with than what we had originally. Additionally, these music streaming services, as has been discussed earlier, also collect information on audience members. They're able to figure out, based on an algorithm, what you like and what you don't like. And so they're really able to tailor music experiences. But this also kind of brings into question our interest in browsing in the future. Do you really want to be able to browse in the future? Or would you rather have a computer kind of suggest to you what's probably most good for you? This is an interesting question. And this is a question that has really cropped up in the last few years when we think about television, film, radio, video games, and all of those things. With every algorithm that is deduced and inferred and placed upon a particular consumer segment, some freedom is given up, because our information is taken from us, it is used, it is harvested, and an algorithm is produced to best figure out what we want. It's interesting to think about an algorithm or a computer knowing what we want better than we do. And it may eventually come to that. But there is a certain joy in discovering new artists. And so I do think while these data companies are trying to target music for everyone and trying to figure out which target audience fits where in the streaming scheme, it's also important to consider how people still find new artists and find new content. And that discovery experience is being modified through the data that we're giving to these companies through and through. Let's move along. So Tidal. Tidal is a really interesting service. It is a streaming service. It is similar to a streaming video on demand service, even though that's kind of reserved for television and video stuff. SVOD service is a good way to think of it here. One of its earliest investors was Jay-Z, the rapper. Tidal for All kind of came about as a campaign in which, artists would own and promote the particular company itself, and they would have music on it. So there have been exclusive albums by Jay-Z, Beyonce, and Kanye West, among others. Arcade Fire also is another one that has exclusive content on the music service itself. So it's been billed as a platform for artists. Sprint has purchased a third of Tidal for $200 million. The streaming service right now is a little cash-strapped. It has since made headways into moving into Africa. So Tidal is pushing itself into the African market. I don't know what the market is like, but they've seen an opportunity to expand their music company into Africa. One of the biggest selling points of Tidal are the exclusive albums that it has. So if you subscribe to Tidal, you can have exclusive gain over Jay-Z's 444, which was his latest album, among other select albums. So the interest there, the appeal there, is that if you sign up for this service, you'll have something that other people won't, right? We're going to make it worth your while to subscribe to this. Now, if you think about it, it kind of makes sense to some extent, because really every music streaming service pretty much the same, right? You can listen to Taylor Swift on Pandora. You can listen to Taylor Swift's entire album on Spotify. So there aren't as many differences between these particular services. So as a result, you have to figure out something that's exclusive or unique. Differently, if we think about streaming services on television, that's easy. Netflix has its own originals, Hulu has its own originals. That's simple. You may not get everything that you have on Netflix on Hulu and vice versa. The music industry with streaming services, it's largely been the case that most artists are available everywhere. So the music streaming services are very much like movie theaters, right? If we think about parallels across platforms, because I can go to a movie theater at Cinema Deluxe, or I can go to AMC, or I can go wherever I want to go. The Avengers 3 is going to be playing everywhere. The latest Batman movie, the latest Jurassic Park movie. I don't really have to worry about where I'm going to find the content, so the experience has to shift. And that's a little bit of what Tidal is trying to do here by creating and promoting exclusivity here. Let's move along. If we think about music genres are very, very interesting. I think they're indicative of times. I think they're indicative of where we listen to them as well. And so through history and through the things that we do as people, music genres have had to evolve along. So pop music is kind of the pop music is the linchpin by which we kind of structure our own pop culture around. And so pop music is short for popular music. It first came about in the 1930s during vaudeville circuits. So we start gaining an appreciation for certain artists that continue to come to the stage and really present something that's interesting. Rudy Vallee and Bing Crosby established themselves as crooners, or people who sing pop standards. In the 1940s, we have Frank Sinatra, who comes out as really the first major teen star. His concerts create riots similar to later rock and roll concerts. And crooners were very, very unique in that they were able to write these really long romantic songs, and songs that really were unique in their own right. They were not very repetitive lyrically. They really did try to tackle a lot of different topics. Loneliness, being single, breaking up, really, really different from what had been done previously at that time. Let's move along. So crooners do come from big bands. Big bands, orchestras at this time, Glenn Miller Band and Tommy Dorsey Band. All of these different bands have singers. But then these singers start to realize that, well, nobody's there for the saxophonist or violinist usually. People come for the singer, because the singer is able to really differentiate themselves the most. If we think of how somebody sings versus how somebody else sings, there's probably more variability there than in how somebody plays the saxophone compared to how somebody else plays the saxophone. If you're a really good saxophone player, there may be little variability there. Whereas with singers have distinctive voices, singers have distinctive looks, singers don't look like two saxophones. Singers look like two different people. And so from all of those different characteristics and elements, singers in these orchestral bands begin to kind of break away. Frank Sinatra got his start in the Tommy Dorsey Band. And so from there, his marketability grew. And so if we go back to that slide, crooners are especially interesting because they are able to sing these really, really long and complex ballads. Frank Sinatra comes up with really one of the first prominent concept albums. Concept album is a concept. It's a concept about something. And so the entire album is devoted to that. And unfortunately, we don't really see that anymore. Kendrick Lamar's Damn, which came out a few years ago, is probably one of the latest examples of a concept album, because that album was focused on a lot of different obstacles and challenges and things that are wrong with society. And so in that vein, Kendrick Lamar's latest album, or that album Damn, is indicative of a concept album. Here in the wee small hours of the morning, you can see here Frank is being reflective, and he is pondering quite a bit, and he's being very pensive, and it's a desolate road in the city, and he's smoking a cigarette, and there's kind of a blue hue everywhere, which suggests that it's really late at night, and he's alone. And so this is a sad album. And it is a sad album. The album talks about missing women and being alone and being single and how to make it kind of on your own. It's a wonderful album. It's very, very beautiful, and it's one of my favorites. And this album really set the tone for what it really means to create a concept album. Let's move along. American Bandstand in the 1950s, hosted by Dick Clark. So Dick Clark is a proud Syracuse alum, which is where I did my grad work. And so we have the Dick Clark Studios in his memory, which are very, very beautiful. And Dick Clark was the first really popular DJ in the United States. American Bandstand featured teenagers dancing and latest hits, as well as interviews by artists themselves. And so from this, Dick Clark begins to build a pop culture, really a visual pop culture. Students, children are able to race home at 3 o'clock, and they're able to get a sense of what's popular, what isn't popular, what should I be listening to, how should I be dressing, what should I be doing with all of these things. And so from here, a pop culture is formulated. And it's a pop culture that every teenager can kind of plug into, right? People in Oregon see the same thing as people in New York, as people in Florida, as people in Texas. And so there's kind of this mass pop culture that really springs out from this. This is a forerunner for TRL, or Total Request Live on MTV, or other shows that highlight artists. And so this was really the first stab at really connecting people to artists. This is also exciting because before this, the only time you would really hear Frank Sinatra is maybe on the radio, maybe giving an interview if he wasn't singing. Otherwise, you really wouldn't get to hear their voices, you wouldn't get a sense of their personalities. So now we're learning more about our entertainers, and we're able to be plugged in more. This is way, way different than what had been done previously. So consumers are able to kind of match their own perception of an artist with how the artist actually is in front of the camera. And so they're able to get a better sense and read into the celebrity, which of course creates another industry in newspapers following celebrities and getting interviews and taking photos and doing all of these other things that really create the cult of celebrity that we now have today. Let's move along. With rock and roll, it's a slang term for sex. It quickly becomes embroiled in controversy. And so Elvis Presley is one of the forerunners of rock and roll alongside Chuck Berry. He was routinely criticized for the way in which he rolled his hips and danced in front of teenagers. Rock and roll changed sound recording and radio. There are different standards for how music was produced, distributed, and even performed. Remember, if we think about Frank Sinatra and the way that he sings, every word is pronounced clearly. Every word can be understood. It's very difficult to not understand that kind of music, crooner music, that is. With rock and roll, you know, people are screaming, yelling. There's a guitar, there are drums. It's really loud. Lyrics are less important. Not as much with Elvis Presley. Lyrics are more or less important, definitely today. But with Elvis, lyrics were still important, but a little less so. Guitar riffs, drums, other competing voices, if you will, were in the recording studio. And so rock and roll is also a way for teenagers to rebel. It's the 1950s. We've just wrapped up World War II in about 1945, 1947. We do have the Korean War brewing. We are afraid of the Soviets at this time. The Cold War is in effect, and it will kind of ramp up in the 60s for sure. But by and large, there's kind of a peacetime here in the United States. The 1950s were a time of prosperity for a lot of people. Going to college, buying homes, having families, really stepping into the middle class. And so for a lot of teenagers, suburbia is a place full of pleasure. And, you know, the first kind of generation in which you could kind of almost do a little bit of whatever you wanted to do. You could go to college. You didn't have to do what your father did. You didn't have to do what your mother did. And so there's a little bit more freedom that's expressed and accrued by this fresh batch of teenagers. And so with this comes, you know, a sense of rebellion. If you're not going to war, why not rebel against your parents? And so there is this rebelliousness to really explore other things, right? When a country is not in war and when they're not in turmoil, be it social or financial, we can kind of wander elsewhere, right? There's a reason why we have periods of social change when there isn't war. as well, because people are able to kind of reflect and think and criticize society if we don't have missiles and guns and other issues, external issues that are kind of at us. So the 1950s kind of set the tone for the 60s and 70s, and rebellion, free love, experimenting with drugs, and doing a whole host of other things that were massive deviations from what had been done before. Right, for each generation subsequently, it was very common for your parents to live with you. It was common for you to get a job at 15. It was common for you maybe to live till hopefully 40, if that, 45. And so better health care, less war to no war going on in the United States, and opportunity for a lot of teenagers that had never been available in previous generations, all light a flame for rebellion and really strong exploration with music. Let's move along. So the emergence of black-dominated music is interesting. R&B, rhythm and blues, it begins as kind of songs that really delve into loneliness and sadness. They do become more sexually explicit as well. They begin to gain popularity, but of course, R&B is black music at the time, rock and roll is white music at the time, which is absolutely ridiculous because we had really a lot of overlap in both. And without black musicians, much of what we know in R&B and rock and roll would not be around. Chuck Berry was absolutely instrumental in R&B, in rock and roll, as well as B.B. King and then many, many other black artists, including Aretha Franklin and many, many others. And so, you know, it's really important to consider what these music genres would have sounded like without minority and diverse perspectives here. So the 1950s were representative of being repressive, uneasy, and conservative, kind of a humanistic cocktail ripe for urging teens to find music that would allow them to escape, because it's a little bit different now. Let's move along. Motown. Could not talk about music without Motown. There's the promotion of R&B in the 60s through the 80s. Motown founder was Berry Gordy Jr. He was a musician. He had some success in Europe, but he eventually wanted to fund a music recording studio for black artists, for artists that, you know, might be at white labels but maybe weren't treated well, or might be at white labels but maybe had their songs stolen for white artists to play. So Motown had a sound, though. Berry Gordy was very good in branding this. It was a proponent for soul and R&B music. It incorporated strong bass, horns, tambourines, and call and response, notably used from religious songs. Like, if you think of Otis Redding's, you know, famous songs such as Shout, you know, you make me want to shout, and there's kind of a callback, you know, hey, hey, oh, right? You know, getting audience members to kind of chime in was part of the Motown sound. That call and response has its roots in Baptist churches, which black people frequented, especially during that time. Aretha Franklin comes out with Respect. That is a song, really an anthem for women kind of putting their foot down for the way men had treated them. And remember, this is a time in which women are not welcomed still to divorce, although it's coming. Women are not welcome to live on their own, although it's coming. Women are not welcome to have multiple partners, although it's coming. And so women are really starting to be able to kind of flex their wings and moxie and be able to say, yeah, you know, I am woman, hear me roar. I am here. I have control over my own life. I deserve respect. I deserve to be recognized. I deserve to be able to live my life the way that I want to. And so these new songs are starting to realize female empowerment, which was not something that was really explored before then. Capitol Records now has Motown in Los Angeles. So Motown eventually does move from Detroit, even though the Motor City or Motor Town was its home and was how its namesake was developed. Let's move along. So with rock and roll is interesting because it allows artists to figure out that male and female gender roles really weren't as binary as was purported in subsequent generations. Here we see that a lot of artists, and this is Mick Jagger in what looks like a masculine feminine outfit, to play with male and female roles, and rock and roll does this. If you look at Elton John, Boy George, Little Richard, Mick Jagger, and countless others, those who identified as homosexuals, those who identified as heterosexuals, either way, these artists were experimenting with what does it mean to be masculine, what does it mean to be feminine, and it kind of turns masculinity on its head, because some of these artists are still sleeping with scores and scores of women, even though they might not be dressing in leather or as a man would, or in jeans all the time. They're dressing in leather, they're dressing in other kinds of outfits. So rock and roll artists also draw influence from northern and southern regions of the United States. Blues music, R&B, and rock and roll rose from the South and were adopted from the North. This is kind of an interesting paradox here, because in the South we know that most people don't like African Americans. We're not into the blacks in the South, but in the North, we're way more tolerant of minorities. We're way more tolerant of blacks. And so it's interesting to see how these artists really flourished, because for a lot of black artists in particular, they had to come north to get noticed. They had to come north to get recorded. They had to come north to be able to kind of rise and move on with their artistic careers. Woodstock 1969 comes about. Jimi Hendrix, The Who, Janis Joplin performed, and at this concert there were a lot of drugs being taken, a lot of sexual activity going on as well, but it was really an answer back to conservatism and corporatism that was going on. You know, this notion that when you get older, you will put on a suit, you will work 9 to 5, you will have a family, you'll have a nuclear family, and that'll be it, was something that people were able to say, no, I don't have to do that. I don't have to go to college. Or if I do go to college, I don't have to put on a suit and kind of be whatever, my father was. I don't have to be lame. I don't have to be boring. I don't have to be dull. I don't have to do the same thing every day. I can live my life differently. I don't have to get married right away. Wow. That's a lot. Some of you today may be under pressure by your families to go to college, to get married, and all of those things, but I'd like to think that we live in a time in which we're really not pressured to do anything. It really is up to us what we'd like to do with our own lives, as long as we're productive members of society, of course. But back then, that realization was captured in a bevy of songs. The Who recording Teenage Wasteland, Jimi Hendrix recording Along the Watchtower, Led Zeppelin recording Stairway to Heaven. All of these kinds of songs captured different experiences and different mindsets of people. We don't have to keep doing the same thing that other people are doing. We can be who we want to be. If I want to be a hippie in Oregon and grow vegetables and not get married and have numerous sex partners, or maybe just have a sex partner but not get married, it's okay. That's a major shift for a lot of people in the United States at this point. Music was able to really unshackle a lot of the conservatism and repression that was kind of inherited from the 1950s. And so people get a sense that they can do whatever they want to do. And it's such a liberating time that it's unfortunate that the 60s and 70s were marred by the rampant drug usage that was going on during that time. Because I do think that for a lot of people, freedom, the ability to think, the ability to critique society is very, very valuable. And this really did flourish during the 60s and 70s. Let's move along. Exploitation. So a lot of artists were criticized for exploiting black music, including Elvis. And you can see there a modern Eminem wearing what Elvis wore in his Jailhouse Rock video. I mean, the meaning is still not lost on Eminem. The idea that he has also appropriated black music, namely rap, for his own benefit. And he's exceptionally aware of that. If you watch his videos, he references that. Elvis Presley, among others, are criticized for exploiting black music, appropriating song, sound, swagger on stage. Black artists record and cover Caucasian music. Otis Redding covered the Rolling Stones' Satisfaction. And Jimi Hendrix, who was a black artist, covered Bob Dylan's Along the Watchtower. In my opinion, I think Jimi Hendrix did that song a service. I think his version is better than Bob Dylan's. Black artists were typically at smaller recording studios. Songs were regularly poached by white artists. There was a lot of blatant racism as well. But it starts to subside. Ray Charles covers Don Gibson's country song, I Can't Stop Loving You. There are also payola scandals in the 1950s, which also rocked the industry. Record promoters begin paying DJs to play songs. There's competition because there's only so many hours in the day for a record studio to put out albums, and there's only so many hours in the day for a radio station to play music. Which artist is going to get the most playtime? With payola, record programmers or record producers were starting to pay DJs on the radio to start playing their own artists and play them frequently. Let's move along. The British invasion. The Rolling Stones come. They arrive with a gritty, hard tone that took aim at the establishment. Songs like Satisfaction are indicative of this. The Beatles, a little bit differently, kind of arrive with melodic music that include reinterpretations of American standards. She Loves You. Musical arrangements became complex and demonstrated the songwriting prowess of rock and roll artists. Let's move along. Psychedelic drug-infused rock and roll. We have blues, we have jazz, we have country, we have rock musicians as well. Artists make references all the time to drugs, including Mr. Tambourine Band by Bob Dylan, among other songs. Lucy in the Sky with Diamonds, a lot of people think, which was a song by the Beatles, a lot of people think that's a reference to LSD. Psychedelic Eric was named in part due to the effects of LSD and other drugs that really altered perceptions of reality. It's widely believed that drug consumption could contribute toward writing songs. Jimi Hendrix, in many interviews, who's pictured at the larger photo here, Bob Dylan above him, Jimi Hendrix said in many interviews that drugs were necessary for him to write good music. Steve Tyler of Aerosmith has also said in some interviews that, the drugs did help to some extent. And so this has been a claim from a lot of different artists over time. Let's move along. Punk and alternative rock come out during this time. In the 1970s, we have Bruce Springsteen and Elton John, who start coming out with more rock-oriented, piano-oriented rock music. Disco is also prevalent. Gloria Gaynor's #1 hit, I Will Survive, is very much indicative of disco. Disco is wonderful in this regard because it kind of has a beat that everybody is familiar with. And so it's very much dance-oriented music. And so disco eventually bleeds into techno, but disco is kind of the forerunner for dance music. Really, really popular dance music, music that is meant to be danced to, not so much listened to. Punk music rises to challenge the orthodoxy and commercialization of the record business. The Police come out. The lyrics are more serious, deeper metal riffs as well. The Police are indicative of this with Roxanne. We also start having places to go to kind of catch the new acts, right? So we have CBGB's in New York City, which features artists at the time, including the Ramones and Blondie and the Talking Heads. There's also a movement that spreads to England where there's much instability among unemployment and growing inequality. So from this, we have the Sex Pistols, the Clash, the Buzzcocks, the Police, the Banshees, and others that come out. Well, if we think about where the 1970s were and kind of where the 1980s went, a few things wound up happening here. The 1970s were a seminal moment for a lot of people in the United States. It was a time in which we critiqued society and we really thought about things that went wrong or were wrong in society. Women's equality, the issue that it lacked in this country during the time, the war that was brewing in Vietnam during this time. Other elements that really perturbed and bothered artists were captured in a lot of music. Differently, in our next lecture surrounding the 1980s and beyond, there's kind of a shift again. The 1980s offer a conservative moment in which we think about yesteryear and we think about the 1950s and we think about decades past. Additionally, in the 1980s, there's kind of a me, me, me movement, whereas the 60s and 70s were a little bit more about society and people being together. The 1980s swings right back to individualism. This notion of getting rich quickly, getting ahead, having sex, getting drugs, being able to kind of live your life at a very, very fast pace is indicative of people who are aspiring to work on Wall Street. people who are indicative of having wealth, people who are, it is indicative of people who are seeking to be their own master, to be their own boss. And so a lot of the music that comes out in the 1980s tries to capture this particular sentiment. Well, that's all the time we have here on Late Night Learning. As always, keep laughing and keep learning.